We all know the pain of being judged by how we look. We've all felt the sting when someone decides our worth before they know our heart. In ancient Norway, a warrior named Bjarke returned home expecting a beautiful bride. Instead, he got Runa. She was not what he wanted. The clan laughed at her size. Even Bjarke said, "This can't be her." But Runa had something no one expected. Her marriage chest held no gold. Instead, it was filled with scrolls of healing and battle wisdom. While others mocked her, she quietly helped wounded warriors. She won debates that silenced proud chiefs. Slowly, Bjarke began to see what others missed. When danger came to their fjord, only Runa's knowledge could save them all. But would Bjarke's wounded pride destroy them both before he learned this lesson? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salt wind carried the scent of snow across the black waters of Vestfjall, where the great longships rested like sleeping dragons against the wooden docks. Bjarke, Skullsplitter, stood at the prow of his vessel, watching the familiar mountains rise from the mist like ancient guardians. 3 years had passed since he'd sailed east to raid and conquer. 3 years of blood and gold that had made his name a whisper of fear in distant lands. His sword, still stained with the rust of foreign blood, hung heavy at his side. The weapon had drunk deep from the veins of Saxon nobles and Slavic princes. Each notch in its iron blade told a story of victory, each scratch a testament to his prowess. The sword was more than steel, it was his identity, his worth measured in the lives it had taken. Behind him, his warriors sat hunched over their oars, their beards thick with ice and their eyes bright with the promise of home. They had followed him through storm and slaughter, trusting in his strength to bring them safely back to their families. Gold and silver filled the belly of their ship, enough to buy comfort for a dozen winters. But for Bjarke, the greatest treasure awaited on shore, his promised bride. The Jarl of Vestfjall had sworn it 3 summers ago, before the raids began. "Bring me victory in the eastern lands," Thorvald had declared, his one good eye gleaming with greed, "and I'll give you the finest maiden in all the fjord. A woman worthy of your legend, Skullsplitter." Bjarke had dreamed of her during the long nights of campaign. Golden hair that caught sunlight like spun wheat, eyes blue as the deepest ocean, a shield maiden's strength wrapped in feminine grace. She would be his equal in beauty, a prize that matched his prowess in war. Their children would be legends themselves, carrying his bloodline into saga and song. The harbour of Vestfjall spread before them now, its wooden walkways busy with fishermen and traders. Smoke rose from the great hall where Jarl Thorvald held court, the buildings carved dragon heads, snarling down at all who approached. The settlement had grown in his absence. New houses dotted the hillside, and the defensive walls had been strengthened with fresh timber. As they drew closer to shore, Bjarke could see the crowd gathering. Word of his return had spread quickly, as news always did in the close confines of the fjord. Children ran along the docks, their excited voices carrying across the water. Women clutched their shawls against the cold wind, searching the returning faces for their husbands and sons. Old men leaned on walking sticks, ready to hear tales of distant battles, but Bjarke's eyes sought only one figure, the maiden who would soon be his wife. The ship's keel scraped against the dock with a sound like grinding teeth. His warriors leaped onto the wooden planks, securing ropes and unloading their precious cargo. Chests of silver, bolts of silk, and weapons of foreign make created small mountains on the harbour. The crowd pressed closer, marveling at the wealth their warriors had won. Jarl Thorvald approached with measured steps, his scarred face set in its perpetual scowl. Age had bent his shoulders but not broken his spirit. His remaining eye, sharp as a hawk's, took in every detail of the returning expedition. Behind him walked his trusted advisors and the most prominent families of the settlement. "Bjarke Skullsplitter," the Jarl called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades. "The ravens told me of your victories. They say you burned 3 cities and broke a king's army." Bjarke stepped onto the dock, his boots solid on the familiar wood. "I kept my oath, Jarl Thorvald. The eastern lands know our strength. Their gold fills our ships, and their fear will keep them from our shores for generations." The crowd murmured approval, but Bjarke barely heard them. His gaze swept the assembled faces, searching for the beauty he'd been promised. Surely she would be here, eager to meet her returning hero. Perhaps she stood with the other high-born daughters, her golden hair marking her as surely as a beacon fire. "Then it's time I kept mine," Thorvald said, a strange smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Your bride awaits as promised. The finest maiden in all the fjord." He gestured and the crowd parted. Bjarke's heart quickened with anticipation. This was the moment he'd imagined countless times during the long campaign. The first sight of his destined wife. The woman who would bear his sons and share his legacy. A figure stepped forward from the shadows of the great hall. She was not what he expected. Runa stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, her dark hair braided simply and her wool dress practical rather than fine. She was broad-shouldered and sturdy, built for work rather than ornament. Her face was pleasant enough, with intelligent brown eyes and strong features, but she bore no resemblance to the golden goddess of his dreams. When she moved, it was with purpose rather than grace, her steps sure but unremarkable. The silence stretched like a bowstring drawn too tight. Bjarke felt the eyes of the entire settlement upon him, waiting for his reaction. His mouth opened, but no words came. This couldn't be right. This couldn't be the reward for 3 years of blood and victory. "This can't be her," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Thorvald's smile widened, cruel as a winter wind. "Oh, they gave you the fat one," he said, loud enough for all to hear. The crowd erupted in laughter, the sound harsh against the mountain walls, but Runa didn't flinch. She met Bjarke's shocked stare with calm dignity, then slowly approached. In her hands, she carried a wooden chest, its surface carved with intricate patterns. The laughter died as she set it before him and lifted the lid. Inside lay no gold or precious stones. Instead, the chest held scrolls of parchment, each one carefully rolled and tied with simple cord. The topmost scroll bore drawings of herbs and healing plants, with notes written in a careful hand. Another showed tactical formations and siege techniques. Maps of distant lands lay beneath treaties written in multiple tongues. "My dowry," Runa said simply, her voice steady despite the crowd's mockery. "Knowledge gathered over many years. Healing arts learned from my father. Strategy studied from ancient texts. Wisdom earned through observation and thought." She looked up at Bjarke, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes, not the desperate need for approval he expected, but a quiet strength that needed no validation from anyone. "I know I'm not what you hoped for," she continued, "but perhaps in time you'll find value in what I can offer." The silence returned, heavier now. Bjarke stared down at the scrolls, his mind struggling to process this unexpected turn. The crowd watched, waiting to see if the great skull-splitter would accept this unusual bride or reject her publicly. In the growing quiet, Runa closed the chest and stepped back. She didn't plead or protest, didn't try to make herself more appealing. She simply waited, patient as stone, for his decision. Somewhere in the crowd, a child coughed. A seabird cried overhead. The wind rattled the rigging of the moored ships, and Bjarke, skull-splitter, destroyer of cities and breaker of armies, found himself at a loss for words. The wooden chest sat between them like a bridge he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. His bloodied sword, symbol of all his victories, felt suddenly heavy at his side. Around them, the people of Vestfjall held their breath, sensing that this moment would shape more than just one marriage. It would define what their community truly valued. Runa's quiet dignity filled the space where his expectations had crumbled, challenging everything he thought he knew about worth and strength. The scrolls in her chest promised knowledge he'd never considered valuable, wisdom that had nothing to do with the edge of a blade. As the crowd waited and the wind grew colder, Bjarke realized that his greatest battle wasn't behind him in distant lands. It was right here, in the space between his pride and the woman who stood patiently before him, offering gifts he didn't yet know how to value. The marriage ceremony was set for sunset, when the sky would blaze red like a warrior's funeral pyre. Custom demanded that the union be witnessed by the entire clan, sealed with ancient words that bound two lives together until death claimed them both. But as the hours passed, Bjarke's resolve crumbled like a castle built on shifting sand. He stalked through the settlement like a caged wolf, his warriors giving him wide berth. The familiar sights of home, the smithy where his first sword had been forged, the mead hall where he'd earned his first scars in boyhood fights, all felt foreign now. Every face he passed seemed to mock him with knowing looks. Every whispered conversation died when he approached. The great hall had been prepared for feasting. Long tables groaned under platters of roasted meat and wheels of cheese. Barrels of mead and ale stood ready to flow like rivers. Garlands of pine and holly decorated the carved pillars, their green brightness a stark contrast to the dark wood. Everything spoke of celebration, of joy, of a warrior claiming his rightful reward, but Bjarke felt only shame burning in his chest like swallowed coals. As the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, the people of Vestfjord gathered in the hall. Warriors who had sailed with him to distant shores took their places at the high table. Craftsmen and farmers filled the benches below. Women in their finest dresses clustered near the walls, their children pressed close beside them. All eyes turned toward the great doors, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Jarl Thorvald entered first, his ceremonial cloak rich with gold thread, and his remaining eye bright with anticipation. Behind him came the settlement's most honored elders, men whose beards had gone white in service to the clan. They carried the ancient symbols of marriage, a sword for the groom and a crown of braided grain for the bride. Runa appeared in the doorway and a hush fell over the assembly. She had dressed in her finest clothing, a blue wool dress dyed the color of deep water and embroidered with silver thread. Her dark hair had been woven with small white flowers, and a simple silver band encircled her brow. She moved with quiet dignity, her head held high despite the weight of 100 stares. She was not beautiful in the way men sang of in their tales, but there was something compelling about her presence. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and needed no one's approval to prove it. Her brown eyes held depths that spoke of intelligence and compassion, qualities that meant nothing to a hall full of warriors drunk on tales of conquest. Bjarke entered last, and the crowd rose to their feet. His polished mail shirt caught the torchlight, and his famous sword hung at his side like a badge of honor. He had combed his yellow beard and braided his hair with gold rings taken from Eastern princes. By all outward signs, he was the perfect image of a successful warrior claiming his prize, but inside, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The ceremony began with the traditional words. Jarl Thorvald spoke of duty and honor, of the bonds that held the clan together through storm and strife. He praised Bjarke's victories and proclaimed Runa a worthy bride for such a hero. The words rolled over the assembly like familiar music, comfortable and expected. When the moment came for Bjarke to accept his bride, he hesitated. The sword in his hands felt heavier than a mountain. Runa stood before him, patient and waiting, her eyes holding no judgment despite the humiliation she must surely feel. The entire hall watched in growing confusion as their celebrated hero struggled with what should have been a moment of triumph. "I cannot," Bjarke said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly through the silence. "I cannot do this." The words hit the assembly like a physical blow. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Runa's face didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Not surprise, but a kind of weary acceptance that cut Bjarke deeper than any enemy blade. "You refuse your promised bride?" Thorvald's voice was deadly quiet, but his fury radiated like heat from a forge. "You reject the reward I offered for your service." Bjarke's mouth worked soundlessly. How could he explain the storm in his mind? How could he tell these people that their hero was nothing but a proud fool who valued appearance over substance? "She's not. You expected what?" Thorvald stepped closer, his scarred face terrible in the torchlight. "You expected me to break faith with you? To deny you the finest maiden in the fjord, as I promised?" The hall erupted in angry voices. Warriors who had followed Bjarke to battle shouted their confusion and disappointment. Women who had admired Runa's quiet kindness called shame on the man who spurned her. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts, frightened by the sudden violence in the air. Through it all, Runa stood silent and still, a point of calm in the chaos. She removed the grain crown from her head and set it gently on the ceremonial table. Then she turned and walked toward the doors, her dignity intact despite the ruin of her wedding day. But before she could leave, a commotion erupted near the back of the hall. A young warrior had stumbled, clutching his side, where blood seeped through his fingers. He'd been injured in a training accident that afternoon, and the excitement of the ceremony had reopened his wound. Without hesitation, Runa changed direction. She reached the wounded man in 3 quick strides, her hands already moving to assess the damage. "Sit him down," she commanded, her voice calm and sure. "Bring me clean cloth and hot water." The chaos around her faded as she worked. Her fingers probed the wound with gentle skill, determining its depth and danger. She spoke quietly to the injured warrior, her words soothing his fear. When the supplies arrived, she cleaned and bound the cut with movements that spoke of long practice and deep knowledge. The hall grew quiet again, but this time it was a different silence. People leaned forward to watch as Runa saved a life with the same confidence that Bjarke showed in taking them. Her healing arts were not celebrated in songs or carved on memorial stones, but they were no less vital to the clan's survival. As she finished her work, Runa looked up to find every eye in the hall upon her. But these weren't the mocking stares from the harbor. These were looks of respect, gratitude, and perhaps understanding. The wounded warrior clasped her hand, his eyes bright with tears of relief. "Thank you," he whispered. "You've saved my life." Runa smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd shown all day. "It's what I do," she said simply. "It's who I am." She rose and once again turned toward the doors. This time no one tried to stop her. But as she passed Bjarke, she paused for just a moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear. "I know I'm not the bride you wanted," she said, "but I am the one you were given. Perhaps someday you'll understand the difference between what you want and what you need." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of herbs and the echo of wisdom that cut through Bjarke's pride like a blade through silk. The great hall remained silent as the settlement's greatest warrior stood alone, surrounded by the broken pieces of his expectations and the bitter taste of his own shallow judgment. In his hand, a fragment of the ceremonial crown lay where it had fallen, a piece of braided grain that would never complete its purpose, a symbol of promises broken and chances lost. The broken shield fragment would become his constant reminder of how pride could shatter more than just expectations. It could destroy the very thing that might have made him whole. The days following the broken wedding passed like winter, storms cold, bitter, and endless. Bjarke found himself trapped in a prison of his own making, living in the same longhouse as the woman he had publicly humiliated. Custom demanded they share quarters as betrothed partners, even though no vows had been spoken. The space between them felt wider than the ocean he had crossed to reach distant shores. Runa moved through their shared dwelling like a gentle spirit, never acknowledging the awkwardness of their situation. She rose before dawn to tend her herb garden, the small plot behind the longhouse where she grew the plants that filled her healing pouch. The leather satchel, worn smooth by years of use, never left her side. It contained remedies for fever, salves for wounds, and powders that could ease pain or bring peaceful sleep. Bjarke watched her from the shadows, his warrior's instincts making him aware of her every movement. She worked with quiet efficiency, her hands sure as she harvested leaves and roots. When she ground herbs with her mortar and pestle, the sound was rhythmic and soothing, like a mother's lullaby. The scents that filled their home, mint, willow bark, chamomile, were foreign to a man accustomed to the smells of leather and steel. She never spoke to him directly unless necessity demanded it. When she did, her voice was courteous but distant, as if he were a stranger sharing her roof rather than the man who should have been her husband. The courtesy cut deeper than anger would have. It showed him exactly how little he mattered in her daily existence. The settlement buzzed with gossip about their strange arrangement. Old women clicked their tongues in disapproval when Bjarke passed, their eyes full of judgment. Young warriors who had once hung on his every word now seemed uncomfortable in his presence. Children stared openly until their mothers hushed them away. But the most painful moments came when Bjarke witnessed Runa's daily work among the people. Every morning, she made rounds to check on the sick and injured. The blacksmith's daughter suffered from a persistent cough that had plagued her through the winter. Runa brought her tea made from pine needles and honey, sitting patiently while the girl sipped the bitter medicine. An old fisherman's joints ached with each change in weather. She massaged salve into his gnarled hands, listening as he told stories of catches made decades ago. These acts of kindness weren't grand gestures that earned songs or stories. They were quiet mercies, small healings that kept the community whole. Yet they demanded skills that Bjarke, for all his prowess in battle, could never master. What good was his sword against fever? How could his strength mend a broken bone, or ease a mother's worry over her sick child? One morning, as he sat sharpening his blade by the fire, voices raised in anger drew his attention to the main hall. Two families were locked in a bitter dispute over fishing rights. The Erikssons claimed the Olafssons had poached from their traditional nets, while the Olafssons insisted the boundaries had never been clearly marked. Jarl Torvald sat in judgment. His weathered face creased with frustration. Such disputes were common, especially as fish became scarcer in the colder months. Usually they were settled with heated words, hurt feelings, and resentment that festered like untreated wounds. But today, Runa stepped forward from the crowd of observers. "May I speak, Jarl Thorvald?" she asked, her voice calm despite the tension in the hall. The old leader studied her for a long moment. Since the wedding disaster, he had treated her with careful respect, perhaps recognizing that his cruel joke had backfired spectacularly. "Speak, daughter." Runa moved to the center of the hall, where both families could see her clearly. "Eriksson, you say your nets were robbed. Olafsson, you say no boundaries were set. But what if you're both right?" The accusers looked at her with suspicion, but she continued undaunted. "The winter has been harsh. Fish are scarce, and both your families struggle to feed your children. Perhaps the real question isn't who owns what waters, but how all of us can survive until spring returns." She gestured toward the great map that hung on the hall's wall, marking the fjord's waters and known fishing grounds. "My father taught me to read the old charts. There are deeper waters to the north, places our boats rarely visit because they're harder to reach. If both families work together, sharing boats, nets, and knowledge, you might find better catches than either could manage alone." The suggestion sparked immediate protest from both sides, but Runa pressed on. "Eriksson, your family has the strongest nets in the settlement. Olafsson, your sons know these waters better than anyone. Combine your strengths instead of fighting over scraps." Slowly, grudgingly, the families began to listen. Runa spoke of shared profits, rotating fishing schedules, and combined crews that could handle the dangerous northern waters. Her words painted a picture of cooperation that benefited everyone, rather than competition that left some hungry. By the time she finished, the anger had drained from the hall like water from a broken pot. The families agreed to try her plan, at least until the ice broke and spring fishing could begin. They left the hall talking quietly together instead of shooting murderous glares. Jarl Thorvald nodded approvingly as the crowd dispersed. "Wisdom often comes in unexpected packages," he said, loud enough for Bjarke to hear. That evening, as Runa prepared her simple meal of barley porridge and dried fish, Bjarke found himself studying her with new eyes. She moved with the same quiet efficiency as always, but now he began to see the intelligence behind her actions. Every gesture was purposeful, every decision considered. "You ended a feud today," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Runa looked up from her cooking, surprise flickering across her features. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly since the wedding. "I offered a suggestion. The families chose to listen. They wouldn't have listened to me," Bjarke admitted. I would have told them to fight or starve. Something softened in her expression, though she kept her voice neutral. Different problems require different solutions. A sword can't catch fish or calm angry hearts. Outside their window, the first flakes of new snow began to fall, carried on a wind that spoke of storms approaching from the sea. In the distance, fishermen were securing their boats, preparing for another brutal night. Soon the harbour would be locked in ice, trapping the settlement until spring's return. As Bjarke watched the snow accumulate on the windowsill, he realized that winter's true danger wasn't the cold or the storms. It was the way isolation could turn neighbor against neighbor, family against family, until a community tore itself apart from within. But perhaps, if they listened to voices of wisdom rather than pride, they might survive the darkness together. The healing herbs in Runa's pouch rustled softly as she moved about her evening tasks. Their scent a reminder that some strengths couldn't be measured by the edge of a blade. The snow fell heavier as the days shortened, blanketing Vestfjall in a silence broken only by the creak of settling timber and the distant howl of wind through the mountain passes. The settlement turned inward, families gathering around their hearth fires while the world outside grew hostile and white. But for Bjarke, the longest nights were spent watching Runa by the flickering light of oil lamps, studying scrolls that held secrets he had never thought to value. She worked late into the evening hours, her fingers tracing ancient texts while he pretended to sleep on his fur-covered bench. The parchments were covered in symbols and diagrams that meant nothing to his warrior's eye. Maps of distant lands, formations of troops he didn't recognize, strategies for sieges he had never imagined. One scroll in particular seemed to fascinate her, its edges worn from frequent handling. "What are you reading?" he asked one night, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Runa looked up, startled. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows across her face, making her brown eyes appear deeper than mountain pools. "Chronicles of old wars," she said quietly. "My father collected them from traveling scholars and merchants." She hesitated, then held up the worn scroll. "This one tells of a battle fought 200 years ago, when the Danes tried to take the fortress at Stamford. The defenders were outnumbered 3-1, but they held for 40 days. How?" Bjarke found himself leaning forward, drawn despite his skepticism. Runa's finger traced the faded illustrations on the parchment. They didn't meet strength with strength. Instead, they used the land itself as a weapon, blocked the river to flood the approach roads, built false walls that collapsed when the enemy climbed them, made the attackers fight the ground instead of the men. The concept was foreign to everything Bjarke had learned about warfare. In his experience, battles were won by courage, skill, and the sharpness of one's blade. The idea of using deception and terrain as weapons seemed almost dishonorable. "Trickery," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Survival," Runa corrected. The fortress stood. The people lived. Sometimes wisdom matters more than courage. She told him of the commander who had devised the defense, a man past his prime in years, but sharp as winter steel in mind. While younger warriors had counseled direct assault, he had studied his enemy's weaknesses and turned them into advantages. The scroll detailed how he had positioned archers not for maximum killing, but to drive the attackers into carefully prepared killing zones. How he had used fire ships to break enemy formations on the river. How he had won not through heroic charges, but through patient planning and intimate knowledge of his battleground. As she spoke, Bjarke began to see patterns he had missed in his own campaigns. Times when brute force had failed, where subtlety might have succeeded. Sieges that had cost unnecessary lives because he had relied on strength alone. The eastern kingdoms had fallen to his sword, yes, but how many of his own warriors might still be alive if he had fought with his mind as well as his arm? "Your father taught you this?" he asked. Runa nodded, rolling the scroll carefully and setting it aside. "He was advisor to my birth father before I came here as a child. He said that anyone could swing a sword, but few took the time to understand why battles were truly won or lost." She pulled another scroll from her collection, this one marked with careful drawings of coastlines and ship formations. This shows how the Northmen of Iceland broke a Frankish fleet without losing a single vessel. They used fog and tides to separate the enemy ships, then attacked each one individually. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of meeting a superior force head-on, the outnumbered Vikings had turned the sea itself into an ally. They had studied wind patterns and current flows until they knew exactly when and where to strike. Victory had come not from heroic dueling, but from understanding their environment better than their enemies. "Show me more," Bjarke said. Surprising himself with the words, they spent the next several hours bent over the ancient texts. Runa's voice was soft but animated as she shared the knowledge her father had passed down to her. She spoke of generals who had won through patience, of armies that had triumphed through coordination rather than individual valor. Each story challenged Bjarke's understanding of what made a true warrior. The oil in their lamp began to run low, casting longer shadows across the scrolls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and sending spirals of snow through the gaps in the walls. But neither of them seemed to notice the cold. "Here," Runa said, unrolling a map that showed the fjords and islands around their own settlement. This came from a merchant who sailed north to trade with the Sami. "Look at these coastal defenses." The map revealed a network of watchtowers, hidden anchorages, and signal fires that could coordinate resistance across hundreds of miles of coastline. Small communities had learned to work together, sharing information and resources to defend against raiders who might overwhelm any single settlement. "We could do this," Bjarke found himself saying. The smaller fjords to the south, they face the same threats we do. Pirates from the Western Islands, raiders from Denmark. If we shared warnings, coordinated our defenses— He stopped abruptly, realizing what he was saying. Here he was, a man who had built his reputation on individual prowess, talking about cooperation and planning. The irony wasn't lost on him. Runa was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not mockery, but something closer to hope. "You see it," she said quietly. "The difference between fighting and winning." Before he could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Voices were calling through the settlement, urgent and alarmed. Bjarke moved to the window and peered through the shutters into the swirling snow. Torches bobbed in the darkness as people emerged from their homes. Someone was shouting about ships seen offshore despite the storm. Enemy vessels or traders seeking shelter, no one could tell. But in weather like this, any ship approaching their harbor brought either desperate need or deadly intent. As Bjarke reached for his sword, Runa was already rolling up her precious scrolls and tucking them safely away. Her movements were calm and efficient, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Whatever was coming through the storm, they would face it together, the warrior who was learning to think and the scholar who had always understood that knowledge without courage was merely decoration on a wall. The ancient war. Chronicle lay forgotten on the table. Its lessons about turning disadvantage into strength suddenly more relevant than either of them had expected. The ships proved to be merchants fleeing a storm, their vessels damaged and their crews half frozen. But their arrival brought troubling news from the southern fjords. Strange vessels had been spotted moving along the coast, ships that flew no banners and avoided contact with honest traders. Pirates perhaps, or worse, organized raiders testing the defenses of isolated settlements. The news sparked heated debate in Jarl Thorvald's hall. Warriors called for immediate action, demanding they sail south to hunt down these mysterious threats. Others counseled patience, arguing that winter storms made such expeditions suicide. The discussion grew louder and more fractious as ale loosened tongues and old rivalries surfaced. But when Runa stepped forward to speak, the hall fell silent. "May I suggest a different approach?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Thorvald gestured for her to continue, his weathered face showing grudging respect. Since the fishing dispute, he had begun to value her counsel, though he would never admit it publicly. Runa moved to the great table, where maps of the fjord system lay spread out like ancient prophecies. "We cannot chase shadows through winter seas," But we can make ourselves ready for whatever comes with spring's thaw. She pointed to the narrow entrance of their fjord, where towering cliffs created a natural bottleneck. Here, where the water runs deepest and the current is strongest. If we position ballistae on both cliff tops, we can rain stones on any ship trying to force passage. The suggestion sparked immediate argument. Old Gunnar, who commanded their archers, shook his grizzled head. Those cliffs are 300 feet high. How do we get siege engines up there? How do we supply them? The same way our grandfathers did when they first claimed this fjord, Runa replied calmly. She pulled out a scroll from her ever-present collection, this one showing detailed drawings of pulleys and counterweights. Ancient engineering preserved in these texts. We build the engines in pieces, haul them up section by section. Bjarke found himself studying the diagrams with growing fascination. The mechanisms were elegant in their simplicity, using the enemy's own weight against them, turning the fjord's geography into an impregnable fortress. It was the same principle Runa had shown him in the War Chronicles, using intelligence to multiply strength. What about supplies? Asked Eric Ironbeard, the settlement's most experienced shipwright. Men posted on those cliffs will need food, water, ammunition. Runa traced a thin line on the map that Bjarke had never noticed before. There's an old goat path here, used by hunters to reach the high meadows. With work, it could be widened enough for pack animals. Young Olaf Eriksson, still bitter about the fishing rights dispute, scoffed openly. Goat paths and ancient scrolls. What does a woman know about real warfare? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Bjarke felt his hand drift toward his sword hilt, an instinctive response to protect Runa's honor. But before he could speak, she pulled another scroll from her collection and spread it on the table. This one was different from the War Chronicles. The parchment was covered with intricate diagrams that looked like a child's game, circles and squares connected by lines, with small carved figures positioned at key points. But as Bjarke looked closer, he realized what he was seeing. Hnefatafl, he breathed. The ancient strategy game that every Norse child learned to play. Runa nodded, her fingers moving the carved bone pieces across the board. My father said that all warfare was just Hnefatafl played with living men. The king piece tries to escape to the board's edge, while attackers attempt to surround and capture him. She gestured to their fjord on the map, then to the game board. We are the king, trapped in the center but fighting for survival. Our enemies are the attackers, trying to corner us where we cannot escape. But what if we turn the game to our advantage? Her bone pieces moved across the board with deliberate precision. Instead of trying to flee to the edges, the king piece moved to a corner position where only two sides could be attacked. The attacking pieces spread themselves too thin, trying to maintain the siege, allowing the king's few remaining pieces to strike at weak points. You make them come to you, Bjarke said, understanding flooding through him. Force them into the narrows where numbers mean nothing. Exactly. Runa's eyes met his, and for a moment he saw approval there. A dozen ships in open water are deadly, but in our fjord they must come single file through the channel. One ship at a time, within range of our clifftop weapons. The hall buzzed with excited conversation as warriors began to see the possibilities. Thorvald studied the maps and game board with the intensity of a man half his age. Even Olaf looked grudgingly impressed, though he tried to hide it behind his horn of ale. It could work, the Jarl said slowly, but it means months of preparation. Moving stone and timber up those cliffs, training crews for the ballistae, stockpiling supplies. Then we begin now, Runa said simply. Every day we wait gives our enemies more time to plan their attack. The debate continued long into the night, but the tone had shifted. Instead of arguing whether to act, they discussed how to implement Runa's strategy. Warriors who had dismissed her wisdom now hung on her every word. The carved bone chess pieces sat forgotten on the table, their silent forms a reminder that victory belonged to those who thought beyond the next move. As the crowd finally dispersed, Bjarke found himself alone with Runa beside the dying fire. The chess set lay between them like a bridge across the gap that pride had created. You played against your father, he asked. "Every evening after my lessons," she replied, beginning to pack away her scrolls. He said that a mind trained in strategy could find solutions where strength alone would fail. Bjarke picked up the king piece, a small figure carved with surprising detail. Despite its diminutive size, it dominated the board through position rather than power. "I never learned to play." Warrior sons practice with swords, not game pieces. Runa paused in her packing, considering. "Perhaps it's time you learned. The principles are the same, whether you're moving carved bones or living men." Outside, the wind had died to a whisper, and the snow fell in lazy spirals past their window. Somewhere in the darkness, their enemies might be planning attacks that would test every lesson Runa could teach. But for now, in the warm glow of the dying fire, a warrior who had always relied on strength prepared to learn the deeper mysteries of the strategic mind. The carved chess piece felt heavy in his hand. Weighted with possibilities he was only beginning to understand. The fever struck without warning, cutting through the settlement like an invisible blade. It began with young Sigurd, the blacksmith's apprentice, who collapsed while working the bellows. By the third day, a dozen warriors lay burning with illness, their skin hot as forge iron and their minds lost in fevered dreams. Panic spread faster than the sickness itself. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, afraid to venture out for food or water. The healthy crossed themselves and muttered prayers to the old gods, while the sick grew weaker with each passing hour. The settlement's usual healer, old Astrid, had succumbed on the second day, leaving the people with no one to turn to but Runa. She moved through the crisis like a woman born to it, her healing pouch never leaving her side. The worn leather satchel had been her constant companion for years, but now it became the settlement's lifeline. Inside were packets of willow bark for fever, dried elderflower for breathing troubles, and a dozen other remedies passed down through generations of healers. But this fever was unlike anything she had encountered before. The usual treatments barely touched it, and those who fell into the burning sleep seemed beyond reach of earthly medicine. As Bjarke watched her work, he saw something he had never witnessed before, doubt creeping into Runa's usually confident demeanor. "It's not natural," she told him on the fourth night, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. They stood outside the blacksmith's house, where 3 of his family lay delirious with fever. Fevers burn hot and break, or they take the victim quickly. This one lingers, like it's been crafted to torture rather than kill. The word crafted sent ice through Bjarke's veins. In his campaigns, he had heard whispers of poisoners who could brew sickness like ale, creating diseases that weakened enemies before battle. "You think someone did this deliberately?" Runa's tired eyes met his. "I think we need to find out what all the victims ate or drank in common." This spread too quickly and too specifically. It took the strongest warriors first, leaving the children and elderly untouched. They spent the night moving from house to house, questioning families and searching for patterns. Bjarke found himself following Runa's lead, his warrior's mind adapting to this new kind of investigation. Where once he would have demanded answers with threats, now he listened as she gently coaxed information from frightened relatives. The pattern emerged slowly, like a ship appearing through morning fog. All the victims had shared ale from the same barrel, a cask that had been delivered by the merchant ships that had sought shelter during the storm. The traders had claimed it was a gift from grateful Danes, payment for Vestfjal's hospitality during their time of need. "Poison," Bjarke growled, his hand moving instinctively to his sword. Those weren't merchants fleeing a storm. They were advanced scouts, weakening us for an attack. But Runa was already thinking ahead, her mind racing through possibilities. "If it's poison, there might be an antidote." "My father's scrolls contain formulas from southern lands, remedies for toxins used in warfare." She led him back to their longhouse, where her precious collection of parchments lay hidden beneath their shared bed. As she searched through the scrolls by lamplight, Bjarke felt a familiar frustration building. Here was an enemy that couldn't be faced with sword or spear, a threat that required knowledge he didn't possess. "Here," Runa breathed. unrolling a scroll covered with symbols and drawings of plants he didn't recognize. Byzantine texts on military poisons. This one describes something called the lingering fire, a toxin that burns through the body slowly, designed to incapacitate rather than kill immediately. The description matched their victims' symptoms perfectly. But the antidote required ingredients that seemed impossible to obtain. Rare fungi that grew only in distant forests, minerals found in southern mountains, herbs that bloomed in climates nothing like their frozen fjord. "We don't have these things," Bjarke said, frustration making his voice harsh. "Half these plants don't even grow in our lands." But Runa was studying the scroll more carefully, her finger tracing the ancient symbols. "Wait, look at this notation in the margin. It's in my father's hand. He's made substitutions, northern plants that have similar properties." She grabbed her healing pouch and began sorting through its contents with new urgency. Birch bark instead of cypress leaves, cloudberries in place of southern fruits, mountain herbs to substitute for lowland remedies. It was like watching a master craftsman adapt foreign designs to local materials. "Will it work?" Bjarke asked. "I don't know," Runa admitted, her honesty cutting through his hope. "But it's the only chance they have." They worked through the night, grinding herbs and mixing compounds by the light of oil lamps. Runa's movements were precise despite her exhaustion, each measurement carefully calculated. Bjarke found himself helping where he could, holding vessels steady and fetching water, his large hands clumsy but willing, as dawn broke grey and cold over the settlement. They carried their makeshift medicine to the sickest victims. The first doses went to young Sigurd and two of the strongest warriors, men who had hours rather than days left if the fever continued unchecked. The wait was agony. Runa sat beside each patient, monitoring their breathing and feeling their foreheads for changes in temperature. Bjarke paced like a caged animal, unused to battles where victory couldn't be won with strength or courage. Then, as the sun climbed toward midday, Sigurd's fever broke. The young man's skin cooled, his breathing steadied, and his eyes opened with the clarity of someone returning from a distant shore. Within hours, the other patients began to recover, the terrible fire in their blood finally extinguished. Word spread through the settlement like wildfire. The woman who had been mocked as the fat one had saved their strongest warriors from a poisoner's blade. Men who had laughed at her wisdom now spoke her name with reverence. Children who had hidden from the fever now brought her wildflowers in gratitude. But as Bjarke watched Runa tend to the recovering patients, he realized something had changed in his own heart as well. Somewhere in the long night of grinding herbs and mixing remedies, his respect for her had deepened into something warmer and more dangerous. She had fought death itself with nothing but knowledge and determination. And she had won. The fever-breaking medicine in her pouch had become more than a remedy. It was proof that some battles could only be won by those wise enough to see beyond the obvious enemy, courageous enough to trust in knowledge when strength had failed. The attack came with the morning tide, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of war horns and battle cries, it arrived with a single messenger who walked openly up the beach, carrying a staff of parley and a banner that made Bjarke's blood run cold. The crimson raven on black silk was a symbol he had seen before, in the eastern kingdoms where he had built his reputation. It belonged to the Ironbeak clan of the northern fjords, a family known for their wealth, their cruelty, and their long memories. But what struck him silent was not the banner itself. It was the way Runa went white as fresh snow when she saw it. The messenger was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore rich furs and carried himself with the confidence of nobility. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations. "I am Hakon Ironbeak, come to reclaim what was stolen from my house 23 years ago," he announced to the gathered crowd. His pale eyes swept the assembly until they found Runa, standing frozen among the watching faces. "I have come for my sister." The words hit the settlement like a physical blow. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people turned to stare at Runa with new understanding. Bjarke felt the world shift beneath his feet as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicked into place. "That's impossible," Jarl Thorvald said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Runa has been with us since childhood. She's no royal-born daughter of raiders." Hakon smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Is she not? Look at her face, old man. Look at her eyes, and tell me you don't see the blood of kings." Against his will, Bjarke found himself studying Runa's features with new eyes. The strong jaw he had dismissed as peasant stock. The intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge. The way she carried herself with quiet dignity, never seeking approval, but never backing down from what she believed was right. "My father was Ragnar Ironbeak, Prince of the Northern Reaches," Hakon continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the assembly. "My sister was given to your settlement as an infant, a gesture of peace to end a brewing conflict. But peace has its price, and that price is now due." Runa finally found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "I remember nothing of this. Vestfjord is my home. These people are my family. Blood calls to blood, sister," Hakon replied. "Our father is dead these 5 years, and our lands need a ruler. You are the last of the direct line, the only one who can claim the throne by right of birth." The crowd was buzzing with shocked conversation now. Bjarke heard fragments of whispered speculation about Runa's unusual education, her knowledge of distant lands, the way she had always seemed different from the other children. Details that had meant nothing at the time suddenly took on new significance. "And if she refuses?" Thorvald asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Hakon's hand rested casually on his sword hilt. "Then I'm afraid this peaceful settlement will find itself at war with the combined fleets of the northern fjords. 40 ships, 800 warriors, and siege engines that can reduce your wooden walls to splinters." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everyone present understood the mathematics of survival. Vestfjord might have 200 fighting men on its best day, and most of those were fishermen and farmers who had never seen real battle. Against professional raiders, led by members of the Ironbeak royal family, they would last perhaps a day, but there was something else in Hakon's words, a subtext that made Bjarke's warrior instincts scream warnings. "Why now?" he asked, stepping forward. "If she's been here 23 years, why come for her today?" Hakon's pale eyes fixed on him with predatory interest. "And you are?" Bjarke skull-splitter. "Her betrothed." "Ah, the famous warrior." Hakon's smile grew wider and more unpleasant. "I've heard tales of your eastern campaigns. Impressive work for a sellsword. But you ask a good question." He gestured toward the harbor, where 3 sleek warships rode at anchor just beyond the fjord's mouth. "The northern kingdoms grow restless. The Danes press from the south, the Swedes from the east. Small clans like yours survive only as long as stronger powers allow it. But a royal marriage, a union between the Ironbeak throne and a proven warrior that could change the balance of power across the entire region." The political implications crashed over Bjarke like a cold wave. This wasn't just about reclaiming a lost heir. It was about consolidating power, creating alliances that could reshape the map of the northern kingdoms. And Runa, with her royal blood and strategic mind, was the key that could unlock it all. "I won't go," Runa said, her voice stronger now. "I choose my own fate." "Do you?" Hakon pulled a scroll from his cloak and handed it to Thorvald. "These are the terms of the original agreement. Your predecessors accepted significant payment, gold, weapons, safe passage for your traders, in exchange for sheltering the royal heir. But the contract has a clause that few bothered to read carefully." Thorvald unrolled the parchment with trembling hands. As he read, his weathered face grew ashen. It says she was given in trust, to be returned when called upon to serve the royal house. 23 years of education, protection, and care," Hakon said smoothly. "We've been more than generous. But now the debt comes due." Bjarke felt anger building in his chest like a forge fire. "She's not property to be traded back and forth. She's a free woman who can choose her own path." "Is she?" Hakon's question was gentle, almost sympathetic. Look around you, warrior. See how your people stare at her now that they know the truth. Do you think they'll ever trust her again? Do you think they'll ever see her as one of their own, knowing she carries the blood of their traditional enemies? The words cut deeper than any blade because they carried the sting of truth. Bjarke could see it in the faces around him, fear, suspicion, uncertainty, where once there had been growing acceptance. The revelation of Runa's heritage had poisoned the well of trust she had spent years building. And there's more, Hakon continued relentlessly. The knowledge she carries, battle strategies, diplomatic protocols, the locations of hidden harbors and supply caches, all of it learned from scrolls that belong to our house. Scrolls that contain military secrets worth more than a dozen settlements like this one. Runa's face had gone pale as understanding dawned. The ancient texts her father had collected, the ones that had made her so valuable as a strategic advisor, they hadn't been random acquisitions by a curious scholar. They had been part of her dowry, royal archives preserved for the day when she would need them to rule. So you see, my dear sister, Hakon said softly, you're not just royal blood in a peasant settlement. You're a trained ruler, educated specifically for the day when you would claim your birthright. Everything you've learned, every skill you've developed, has been preparation for this moment. The silence that followed was broken only by the cry of seabirds and the distant sound of waves against the shore. Runa stood in the center of it all, no longer the humble healer who had saved their settlement from fever. She was revealed now as something far more complex and dangerous, a royal heir whose very presence put everyone she cared about at risk. The enemy clan banner fluttered in the cold wind, its crimson raven seeming to watch them all with predatory patience. Hidden within its folds lay the truth that would tear apart everything Bjarke thought. He knew about the woman he was learning to love, and everything she thought she knew about herself. The war council convened at sunset, when the sky burned red like spilled blood and shadows grew long across the settlement. But this was unlike any gathering Vestfjall had ever seen. Instead of warriors debating tactics around familiar tables, they found themselves caught between two impossible choices: surrender their most valuable member or face annihilation from a superior force. Hakon had given them until dawn to decide. His ships waited just beyond the fjord's mouth like patient wolves, their hulls dark against the horizon. From the watchtowers, scouts reported seeing more sails approaching from the north, reinforcements that would make resistance utterly hopeless. Inside the great hall, the mood was as cold as winter stone. Families who had lived together for generations now eyed each other with suspicion. Warriors who had fought side by side questioned loyalties they had never thought to doubt. And at the center of it all sat Runa, no longer the humble healer, but a royal heir whose very existence threatened everything they held dear. "We should give her up," said old Gunnar, his voice heavy with regret. "I've got nothing against the girl, but 40 ships means 800 warriors. We'll be slaughtered if we fight." "She saved my son's life," protested Astrid's daughter, clutching her recovered child close. "When the fever nearly took him, she was the one who found the cure. We can't just hand her over like a piece of property, but what choice do we have?" Eric Ironbeard's weathered hands trembled as he spoke. "I've got grandchildren to think about. My daughter's baby shouldn't die because we're too proud to face reality." The arguments continued, voices rising and tempers flaring as the weight of the decision pressed down on them all. Bjarke sat silent through most of it, his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to lead to disaster. Every warrior's instinct told him to fight, but every strategic lesson Runa had taught him whispered that some battles couldn't be won through courage alone. Finally, Jarl Thorvald called for quiet. The old leader looked every one of his 70 years, the burden of command heavier than ever. "The choice isn't ours to make," he said at last. "Runa is the one they want. She's the one who must decide." All eyes turned to her. She had sat through the entire debate without speaking, her face composed, but her eyes betraying the storm within. When she finally stood, her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she faced. "I need to speak with my brother," she said. "Alone." The request sparked immediate protest from the assembly, but Thorvald nodded grimly. It's her right. If she's to make this choice, she should understand exactly what it means. An hour later, Runa walked down to the beach where Hakon waited beside a small boat. His warriors kept their distance, understanding that this conversation would determine whether they went home with their prize or prepared for siege. The two siblings stood facing each other across 23 years of separation. Their resemblance now unmistakable in the fading light. "You've grown wise," Hakon said, his voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time. "Father would have been proud. What was he like?" Runa asked, curiosity overcoming caution. "Brilliant. Ruthless when necessary, but never cruel without purpose. He built our kingdom from 3 scattered clans into the most powerful force in the northern waters." Hakon's pale eyes reflected the dying sun. "He spoke of you often, especially near the end. Wondered what kind of ruler you would become. And now you know. I tend sick children and resolve fishing disputes. Hardly the stuff of royal legend." Hakon smiled, but it held no mockery. "You united 2 feuding families through wisdom rather than force. You saved warriors from poisoning through knowledge your enemies didn't expect you to possess. You designed defenses that would turn our own naval superiority against us." He gestured toward the cliff tops where the partially constructed ballistae waited. "That's not the work of a simple healer, sister. That's the mind of a born ruler." Runa followed his gaze to the defensive position she had planned. In the growing darkness, she could see torches moving along the heights as work crews labored through the night. Even facing impossible odds, the people of Vestfjall were preparing to fight for their home. "Why didn't you come for me sooner?" she asked. "Why wait until now?" "Because you weren't ready." Hakon's honesty was surprising. A throne taken too young crushes the spirit. A crown worn without understanding breaks both the ruler and the ruled. You needed time to learn what leadership truly meant. He pulled something from his cloak, a signal fire torch, its head soaked in pitch and ready for lighting. "This belonged to our grandfather. He used it to call the clans together when the southern kingdoms tried to invade our lands. On flame on the highest peak, and warriors would come from 100 miles away. The torch was ancient, its wooden handle worn smooth by generations of royal hands. Carved runes ran along its length, symbols of unity and defiance that had once rallied an entire people against overwhelming odds. The northern kingdoms face that same threat now," Hakon continued. "Danish fleets mass in the south. Swedish armies press from the east. Without strong leadership, without alliances built on blood and marriage, our people will be scattered like leaves before a storm. And you think I'm that leader? I think you're the only one who can be." His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You have the bloodline to command respect, the knowledge to outthink our enemies, and something our father never possessed, the ability to inspire loyalty through love rather than fear." Runa turned the torch over in her hands, feeling the weight of history in its ancient wood. "And if I refuse? If I choose to stay here with people who have become my family?" Hakon's expression grew pained. "Then I'll do what I must to protect our kingdom. These people will die, but their sacrifice will be remembered. Your knowledge will still serve our cause, even if you're not alive to guide it." The threat was delivered without malice, but that made it all the more terrible. This wasn't the ravening of a tyrant, but the cold calculation of a ruler who had learned to choose between bad options and worse ones. "How long do I have to decide?" "Until dawn. After that, the choice is made for all of us." As Hakon's boat disappeared into the darkness, Runa climbed slowly back toward the settlement. The torch felt heavier with each step, its unlit flame a symbol of all the burdens she had never asked to carry. Behind her, the enemy ships rode at anchor like sleeping dragons. Ahead lay the only home she had ever known, filled with people who had cared for her and now depended on her decision for their survival. She found Bjarke waiting on the steps of their longhouse, his face grim in the torchlight. "What did he tell you?" "The truth." She sat beside him, the ancient torch resting across her knees. "Everything I've learned, every skill I've developed, it was all preparation for this moment. I'm not just some bastard child hidden away for safety. I'm a weapon, forged over 23 years and now ready for use. You're more than that. Bjarke's voice was fierce with conviction. You're the woman who saved our warriors from poison, who brought peace to feuding families, who turned me from a prideful fool into someone who might actually deserve your respect. Runa looked at him with surprise. It was the closest he had ever come to declaring his feelings, and the timing made it both precious and heartbreaking. If I go with him, the settlement survives, she said quietly. If I stay, everyone I care about dies. What kind of choice is that? The kind that separates rulers from everyone else, Bjarke replied. The burden of making decisions where someone always pays the price. They sat in silence as the night deepened around them. In the distance, hammers rang against metal as workers raced to complete their defenses. Families gathered in their homes, holding their children close and wondering if tomorrow would bring war or peace. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the fjord, 40 ships waited for an answer that would determine the fate of everyone they both loved. The signal fire torch lay cold and unlit between them, a symbol of unity that demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The choice between personal happiness and the greater good, between the life Runa wanted and the destiny that seemed to have been written in her blood from birth. Dawn came grey and cold, with mist rising from the water like the breath of sleeping gods. The settlement had not slept, could not sleep, knowing that sunrise would bring either salvation or slaughter. Warriors stood at their posts along the moor. Wooden walls, their weapons ready, but their hearts heavy with the knowledge that courage alone would not save them this day. Bjarke found Runa standing on the highest watchtower, the ancient signal torch clutched in her hands as she stared out at the enemy fleet. The ships had drawn closer during the night, their dragon prows visible now in the growing light. More sails dotted the horizon, the reinforcements Hakon had promised, arriving precisely on schedule. 53 ships, Runa said without turning around. I've been counting them as they appear. At 20 men per vessel, that's over 1,000 warriors. Our defenses are ready, Bjarke replied, though they both knew how hollow the words sounded. The ballista crews had worked through the night to complete their positions, but 3 siege engines against 50 ships was mathematics that even hope couldn't improve. Runa turned to face him, and he saw that she had reached her decision. It was written in the calm acceptance of her expression, the straight line of her shoulders, the way she held the torch like a sacred relic. I'm going to light it, she said simply. Bjarke felt his heart stop. The signal fire would call for aid from neighboring settlements, but they both knew no help would come in time. It was a gesture of defiance, nothing more, a way of dying with honor intact. Runa, no, there has to be another way. There is. She moved to the fire pit at the tower's center, where dried wood and kindling waited. But it requires something I've never given before. Trust. Before he could ask what she meant, the sound of a horn echoed across the water. Hakon's flagship was approaching under a flag of parley, come to receive his sister's answer. The moment of decision had arrived. Whatever happens, Runa said, touching the torch to the waiting flames, remember that I choose this freely. No one forces my hand. The fire caught with a roar, shooting sparks high into the morning sky. For a moment, Bjarke thought she had simply chosen suicide over surrender. But then she began to speak, her voice carrying clearly across the settlement below. People of Vestfjall, she called, and her words drew every eye to the watchtower. You know what I am now. You know the blood that flows in my veins and the danger my presence brings. But you also know who I choose to be. Warriors and farmers, alike gathered in the settlement's central square, looking up at the woman who held their fate in her hands. Even the workers on the cliff-top ballistae paused to listen. My brother offers me a throne in exchange for your lives, Runa continued. He promises me power, wealth, and the chance to rule over kingdoms. But he asked me to abandon the only family I have ever known. She raised the burning torch high above her head, its flame bright against the grey sky. I am Runa Ironbeak by birth, daughter of kings and heir to northern thrones. But I am also Runa of Vestfjall, healer of your sick, keeper of your peace, and defender of your home." The crowd below stirred with something that might have been hope. "So I offer my brother a different bargain," she declared. "Not the surrender he expects, but an alliance he never imagined. Let the Ironbeak fleet join with Vestfjal's defenders. Let royal blood bind our peoples together, not through conquest, but through marriage freely given." Bjarke felt the world shift around him as he understood what she was proposing. Not submission to her brother's demands, but a complete reversal of the power dynamic. She wasn't offering herself as a hostage. She was claiming her birthright on her own terms. "Bjarke, skull splitter," she said, turning to face him with the burning torch between them. "Destroyer of cities, breaker of armies, will you stand beside? A royal heir who chooses love over politics, family over power." The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over all their futures. Below them, the settlement held its breath. Behind them, 53 warships waited for an answer that would reshape the northern kingdoms. But for Bjarke, the choice was simple. He had spent months learning to see past appearances, to value wisdom over strength, to understand that true worth wasn't measured by the edge of a sword. The woman standing before him, royal or common, heir or healer, was worth more than all the kingdoms her brother could offer. "I will," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the settlement. "Before all gods and men, I claim you as my wife and my equal." The cheer that rose from the crowd below was like thunder rolling across the mountains. But even as the people celebrated, war horns sounded from the approaching ships. Hakon had heard the terms of his sister's counteroffer, and his response was sailing toward them, with steel drawn and battle cries echoing across the water. The signal fire burned bright above them all, no longer a call for help, but a beacon of defiance that would be seen for miles around. The first arrow struck the watchtower's wooden frame just inches from Bjarke's head, its iron point biting deep into the seasoned timber. Below in the fjord, Hakon's ships had formed a battle line, their crews working with the precision of professional raiders. The negotiations were over. Now came the test of steel and strategy. But as the enemy vessels approached the narrow channel that Runa had identified as their greatest weakness, something unexpected happened. The lead ship slowed, then stopped altogether. Shouts of confusion carried across the water as the crew struggled with oars that suddenly felt heavy as mountains. "The tides," Runa breathed, understanding flooding her face. "I miscalculated the timing, but it works in our favor. The morning ebb is stronger than I expected." Bjarke watched in amazement as ship after ship struggled against the current flowing out of the fjord. The vessels that had seemed so threatening moments before now fought just to maintain position, their careful formation breaking apart as captains tried to avoid collisions. "Now," Runa commanded, and her voice carried clearly to the ballista crews on the clifftops. The first massive bolt flew with a sound like tearing silk, striking the lead ship's mast and sending splinters flying across its deck. The second and third followed moments later, their iron points punching through wooden hulls below the waterline. Within minutes, 2 vessels were taking on water, while their crews fought desperately to reach the shore. But Hakon was no ordinary raider. Even as his formation crumbled, he adapted with the ruthless efficiency that had made the Ironbeak clan feared across the northern seas. Signal flags flew between the ships, reorganizing the attack into something Runa's defenses couldn't counter. "He's splitting the fleet," she observed, her strategic mind reading the enemy's movements like words on a page. 3 groups. 1 to force the channel despite the ballistas, another to land troops on the eastern beach, and a third to circle around and attack from the forest approach. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Even if the fjord defenses held, they couldn't protect against attacks from multiple directions. And Hakon had enough ships to make each assault a serious threat. "We can't defend everywhere at once," Bjarke said, his warrior's instincts recognizing the tactical disaster unfolding before them. "No," Runa agreed. "But we don't have to." She pulled an ancient seal from her cloak, a carved piece of whalebone marked with symbols of treaty and peace. Bjarke had never seen it before, but he recognized its significance immediately. This was a royal seal, one that could command respect even in the heat of battle. "What are you doing?" "Something my father taught me from his scrolls," Runa replied, moving toward the stairs that led down from the watchtower. "Sometimes the best way to win a war is to change what you're fighting about." Before Bjarke could stop her, she was running toward the beach, where enemy troops were already beginning to land. Her movement drew shouts from both sides, Vestfjall defenders screaming warnings, enemy warriors raising weapons to strike down the approaching figure. But Runa held the peace treaty seal high above her head, its bone surface catching the morning light. The ancient symbol was unmistakable, its meaning clear to any warrior trained in the laws of war. She was claiming the right of royal parley, a tradition older than any of the kingdoms represented in this battle. Hakon's ship had managed to fight its way through the defensive fire, its scarred hull scraping against the wooden dock. The Iron-Beak Prince leaped onto the pier with sword drawn, his face dark with fury. But when he saw the seal in his sister's hand, he stopped dead. "By the old laws," Runa called, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet battlefield. "I claim the right to speak as heir to the northern throne. Will you hear me, brother?" The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Around them, warriors on both sides held their weapons ready, but made no move to attack. The peace treaty seal commanded respect from all the northern clans, its authority dating back to the first kings who had united the fjords under common law. "Speak," Hakon said finally, though his sword remained naked in his hand. "You came here to claim an heir," Runa said, walking slowly across the beach until she stood within striking distance of her brother's blade. "To secure royal bloodline for the defense of our people. But you thought too small." She gestured toward the defenders on the cliffs, the warriors standing ready despite impossible odds, the families who had chosen to fight rather than abandon their home. "This settlement has shown you something no kingdom can provide, people willing to die for their leader, not because they fear her, but because they love her." "Pretty words," Hakon replied. "But love doesn't stop Danish axes or Swedish spears, doesn't it?" Runa's voice grew stronger, more commanding. "Look around you, brother. Look at what your royal sister has built here. Alliances forged through wisdom instead of fear. Loyalty earned through service instead of demanded through blood. Defenses designed not just to kill enemies, but to preserve what matters most." The peace treaty seal gleamed in her hand, its ancient authority bridging the gap between royal command and earned respect, between the power that demanded obedience and the wisdom that inspired it freely given. The wedding crown was unlike anything the northern kingdoms had ever seen. Woven from healing herbs and strips of parchment taken from ancient war scrolls, it represented the union of two kinds of strength, the power to preserve life and the wisdom to prevent unnecessary death. As Runa stood before the assembled clans, wearing this symbol of her transformed role, even her brother Hakon looked impressed despite himself. 6 months had passed since the confrontation on the beach. 6 months of careful negotiation and delicate alliance building that had reshaped the political landscape of the fjords. The peace treaty Runa had proposed that morning had grown into something far more ambitious, a confederation of northern settlements united not through conquest, but through mutual protection and shared resources. "I still say you're both mad," Hakon muttered as he watched the ceremony preparations, but his tone held affection rather than disapproval. A royal heir who refuses a throne, married to a warrior who'd rather talk than fight. "The southern kingdoms won't know what to make of you." Bjarke, resplendent in a cloak gifted by 3 different clans, grinned at his new brother-in-law. "Let them wonder. Fear of the unknown has kept more armies at bay than all the walls ever built." The great hall of Vestfjall had been expanded twice to accommodate the gathering. Representatives from a dozen settlements filled the benches, their presence a testament to the influence Runa had built through patient diplomacy rather than inherited authority. The fishing families whose dispute she had resolved now managed a cooperative fleet that supplied half the Confederation. The warriors she had saved from poisoning commanded the respect of their peers across multiple clans. As the ceremony began, Bjarke found his thoughts drifting back to that first day on the dock, when his pride had nearly cost him the greatest treasure he could have imagined. The man who had once measured worth by the weight of gold and the sharpness of steel now understood that some riches couldn't be counted in coin or conquest. Runa had taught him to see beyond the surface, to value the quiet strength that built communities rather than the loud violence that destroyed them. In return, he had shown her that royal blood meant nothing without the courage to act on principle, even when that action required standing against family and tradition. "Do you take this woman?" Jarl Thorvald intoned, his weathered voice carrying the weight of ancient ritual. "To be your equal in all things, your partner in wisdom and war, your companion until death claims you both." "I do," Bjarke replied, and meant it with every fibre of his being. The vows Runa spoke in return were equally firm, equally committed. But what made the ceremony truly remarkable was what happened next. Instead of the traditional exchange of weapons that symbolized the joining of two warrior houses, they exchanged symbols of their shared mission. Bjarke presented Runa with a scroll, not one inherited from her father's collection, but one they had written together. It contained the Articles of Confederation that would bind the northern settlements in mutual defense, a document that transformed scattered clans into a unified force capable of standing against any southern invasion. Runa gave Bjarke a ring forged from metal taken from both their swords, his eastern blade that had once defined him, and the ceremonial weapon that had come with her royal heritage. The mingled steel represented their commitment to forge something new from the remnants of their separate pasts. As they exchanged these gifts, the assembled crowd erupted in celebration that echoed across the fjord. But the loudest cheers came from an unexpected source: Hakon's warriors, men who had come expecting conquest, but had found something more valuable in the example of leadership their princess provided. The feast that followed lasted 3 days and drew visitors from settlements as far north as the ice fields and as far south as the Danish borders. Traders brought goods that had never been seen in Vestfjall's markets. Scholars came to study the Confederation's structure and copy its founding documents. Warriors arrived seeking service, with a leader who had proven that victory could be achieved without unnecessary bloodshed. But the moment that mattered most to Bjarke came on the 3rd evening, as the last guests were departing and the settlement was returning to its normal rhythms. He found Runa in their herb garden, tending plants that would become medicines for warriors and children alike. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, settling beside her among the mint and chamomile. "Giving up a throne for a simple life in a fishing village?" Runa looked up from her work, her hands still dirty with soil, and her wedding crown replaced by a practical headband that kept her hair from her eyes. "This isn't simple," she said, gesturing toward the expanded settlement where representatives from a dozen clans worked together on common projects. "We're building something that's never existed before, a kingdom based on choice rather than blood, on service rather than dominance." She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Besides, I didn't give up a throne. I created a better one. As night fell over Vestfjall, the signal fires on the surrounding peaks began to burn, not warnings of danger, but beacons of celebration that would be seen for hundreds of miles. Each flame represented a settlement that had chosen to join their confederation, a community that had decided wisdom was worth more than traditional power. The wedding crown of herbs and parchment sat in their home now, a reminder that true strength came not from what could be taken by force, but from what could be built through patience, understanding, and the courage to see value where others saw only weakness. And in the quiet moments between the great events that would define their reign, a warrior and a healer who had learned to love each other's minds as much as their hearts planned for a future where such love might become the foundation of an entirely new kind of kingdom. The scrolls they would write together would become the basis for a peace that lasted generations. But for now, it was enough to sit among the healing herbs and know that they had chosen well.